Wes Watson was always going back to prison. There are some downfalls that feel shocking. And then there are downfalls that feel inevitable. The story of Wes Watson belongs in the second category. Because when you look at where he is today, facing multiple felony charges, accused of violently assaulting his girlfriend, and sitting in jail once again, it doesn't feel like a sudden collapse. It feels like a destination he was always moving toward. For years, Wes built an empire around one simple message: discipline, accountability, self-respect. Millions of people discovered him through videos filmed shortly after his release from prison. A former inmate with a shaved head, a massive physique, and an intensity that seemed impossible to fake. He spoke about suffering. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about becoming a better man. And people listened. Because unlike most motivational speakers, Wes had scars. He had spent nearly a decade behind bars. He claimed prison taught him lessons that most people would never learn. Lessons about discipline. Lessons about strength. Lessons about character. At first, the message resonated. His channel exploded. His coaching business exploded. His reputation exploded. But success introduced a problem Wes never seemed prepared for. The more people admired him, the more he began admiring himself. The prison stories slowly disappeared. The lessons became lectures. The lectures became insults. And the man who once claimed to help others became increasingly obsessed with proving he was better than everyone around him. The luxury cars appeared. The designer watches appeared. The rented mansion appeared. And with every new display of wealth, the distance between Wes Watson and the man his audience originally admired grew larger. But money wasn't the real problem. Fame wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that behind the image of discipline, there were parts of Wes that prison never fixed. The anger. The ego. The need for control. And eventually, those traits would drag him back toward the very life he claimed to have escaped. Today, Wes Watson stands accused of multiple violent crimes. His online empire is crumbling. Former supporters have turned against him. Former partners have come forward with disturbing allegations. And the man who built a career teaching others how to stay out of trouble may soon find himself exactly where he started. Behind bars. But to understand how it all fell apart, we need to go back to the beginning. Back before the YouTube fame. Back before the money. Back before the motivational speeches. Back to the moment Wes Watson chose a path that would define the rest of his life. The prison story that made Wes Watson famous. One of the reasons so many people connected with Wes Watson was because his story felt authentic. Unlike influencers who claimed to have all the answers, Wes openly admitted that he had destroyed his own life. But the deeper you look into his past, the more complicated that story becomes. Because contrary to what many people assume, Wes didn't grow up in poverty. He wasn't raised in a violent neighborhood. He wasn't abandoned by his family. According to Wes himself, he had a relatively stable childhood. His parents were financially comfortable. They provided a good home. He spent his younger years surfing, skating, and living what many people would consider a normal life. On paper, there was no obvious reason for him to end up in prison. Yet somewhere along the way, things changed. Around the age of 12, Wes began experimenting with drugs. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became a habit. And eventually, it became a lifestyle. Instead of paying for the substances he wanted, he discovered something else. He could sell them. What started as a way to support his own habit quickly turned into a source of income. The money came fast. Faster than anything a teenager could legally earn. And for a young person, that kind of money can feel intoxicating. Not just because of what it buys, but because of what it represents. Power. Status. Freedom. Control. By his own account, the business grew rapidly. He claimed he was moving large amounts of product and making more money than most people his age could imagine. Driving expensive vehicles. Living a lifestyle that seemed impossible for a teenager. And like many people who enter the criminal world, he began believing he was untouchable. Until reality arrived. According to court records, Wes and an associate became involved in a violent robbery targeting a man who owed money from a previous deal. The incident wasn't some minor mistake. It was serious enough that prosecutors pursued multiple charges, including robbery, burglary, and assault. And unlike the stories Wes would later tell online, this wasn't a movie. There was no dramatic comeback. No motivational lesson. Just consequences. In 2010, those consequences arrived. Wes Watson was sentenced to approximately 9 years in prison. A punishment that would consume nearly all of his 20s and a significant portion of his 30s. For most people, prison represents the end of a chapter. For Wes Watson, it would become the foundation of an entirely new identity. Inside prison, he found something he claimed to have never possessed before. Structure. Routine. Discipline. Every day became predictable. Wake up. Train. Read. Repeat. Over and over again. The environment was harsh. The rules were brutal. And according to Wes, survival depended on mental strength just as much as physical strength. Years later, these experiences would become the backbone of his content. Stories about prison politics. Stories about violence. Stories about respect. Stories about what happens when weakness meets a world that has no mercy for it. And people couldn't stop listening. Because prison fascinated them. Most viewers would never experience that world themselves. Wes became their guide. A man who had gone somewhere dark and returned with stories from the other side. But even during this period, there were signs that the future might not be as simple as it seemed. Many of Wes's stories placed him at the center. He wasn't just surviving prison. He was dominating it. He wasn't just respected. He was feared. He wasn't just disciplined. He was different from everyone else. At first, these stories sounded inspiring. Later, some critics would wonder if they revealed something else entirely. A growing need to be seen as exceptional. A need that would eventually become impossible to satisfy. Still, when Wes walked out of prison in 2018, none of that mattered. All anyone saw was a man getting a second chance. A former inmate determined to transform his mistakes into something meaningful. And for a brief moment, it genuinely looked like he was going to succeed. The problem was that prison had changed Wes in ways he understood. And in ways he didn't. Because while prison may have taught him discipline, it may have also taught him that power, intimidation, and dominance were the only ways to earn respect. And that belief would soon collide with internet fame. The ex-convict who became a millionaire guru. When Wes Watson walked out of prison in 2018, he possessed something most influencers spend years trying to manufacture. A story. Not a carefully crafted marketing story. A real one. He had spent nearly a decade behind bars. He had witnessed violence, isolation, fear. And according to his own account, he had used those years to rebuild himself from the ground up. Almost immediately after his release, Wes began posting online. At first, the content was simple. Prison stories. Workout advice. Lessons about discipline. Nothing flashy. No luxury cars. No mansions. No endless displays of wealth. Just a former inmate speaking directly into a camera. And people loved it. Because authenticity was rare. Most motivational influencers talked about hardship. Wes looked like hardship. Every scar, every tattoo, every story gave him credibility. When he spoke about discipline, people believed him. When he spoke about suffering, people listened. When he spoke about changing your life, he seemed like living proof that it could be done. His YouTube channel began growing rapidly. Some videos reached hundreds of thousands of views. Then millions. Comments flooded in from viewers claiming Wes had helped them quit drugs. Get in shape. Fix their relationships. Take responsibility for their lives. For many men, especially those feeling lost, Wes became more than a content creator. He became a role model. And from a business perspective, Wes understood exactly what was happening. Attention was turning into trust. And trust could become money. Soon, he launched coaching programs. Fitness programs. Mindset courses. Business mentorships. The formula was simple. Watch the videos. Become inspired. Buy the program. Many did. And the money started pouring in. For someone who had spent years locked inside a prison cell, the transformation was extraordinary. Wes wasn't just successful. He was becoming wealthy. Very wealthy. At least that's what people believed. And that's when the content began to change. Slowly at first. Almost too slowly to notice. The prison stories became less frequent. The motivational lessons became more aggressive. The advice became less about self-improvement and more about superiority. Instead of telling people how to improve themselves, Wes increasingly told them why they weren't good enough. Why they were weak. Why they were lazy. Why they lacked discipline. For many fans, the tough love approach was part of the appeal. But something else was happening beneath the surface. The message was no longer centered on growth. It was centered on Wes. His routines. His discipline. His achievements. His success. His lifestyle. And as his audience grew, so did his confidence. Then his ego. Then his obsession with status. Luxury watches began appearing in videos. Exotic cars began appearing in videos. High-end real estate began appearing in videos. The former prison mentor was slowly transforming into something else. A symbol of success. Or at least a symbol of what success looked like online. And for a while, it worked. People admired him. People envied him. People wanted to become him. But fame creates a dangerous illusion. The more praise someone receives, the easier it becomes to believe they can do no wrong. Especially when nobody around them is willing to say no. As Wes's business expanded, his public image became larger than ever. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were already beginning to form. Because the qualities that helped him build an audience. His confidence, his intensity. His refusal to back down. Were slowly evolving into something far more destructive. Confidence became arrogance. Intensity became aggression. Self-belief became narcissism. And the audience that once saw a disciplined ex-convict began noticing something different. A man who seemed increasingly obsessed with proving he was better than everyone else. At first, the criticism was easy to ignore. Then it became impossible. Because some of the people closest to Wes were about to make allegations that would completely change how the internet viewed him. And for the first time since leaving prison, the image he worked so hard to build would begin to crack. The man behind the motivation. For years, Wes Watson's audience believed they knew exactly who he was. A disciplined man. A reformed criminal. A leader. Someone who had conquered his demons and was now helping others do the same. But one of the biggest challenges with fame is that eventually, the people closest to you start talking. And when they do, they often reveal a version of you that the public never sees. Around 2022, that process began for Wes. His ex-wife, Valerie Watson, came forward with a series of allegations that painted a very different picture from the one being presented online. According to Valerie, the man viewers admired wasn't the same man she lived with. She claimed Wes had repeatedly mistreated her throughout their relationship. She accused him of cheating, manipulating, controlling, and even physically harming her. Most damaging of all was her claim that Wes didn't follow the very principles he preached to millions of people every day. The same man lecturing strangers about accountability allegedly refused to take responsibility in his own personal life. The same man teaching loyalty was accused of betrayal. The same man promoting self-control was accused of violent outbursts. Naturally, not everyone believed her. When an influencer builds a loyal audience, supporters often dismiss criticism as jealousy, revenge, or attention-seeking. But the accusations didn't simply disappear. Instead, they lingered. And over time, more details began surfacing. Valerie claimed she had protected Wes for years. Protected his image. Protected his reputation. Protected his business. Until eventually she couldn't do it anymore. For the first time, people started asking a dangerous question. What if the man on camera wasn't real? What if the discipline was real, but the character wasn't? That question became even more important as Wes himself started changing. Because while his personal controversies were growing, so was his obsession with displaying wealth. The transformation was impossible to miss. The prison mentor who once talked about purpose now seemed increasingly focused on status. His content became filled with luxury watches, luxury cars, designer clothing, expensive homes, and endless reminders of how successful he had become. Ironically, this created a contradiction. Many longtime viewers remembered Wes criticizing materialism. They remembered the man who spoke about discipline, sacrifice, and inner growth. Now they were watching someone who appeared determined to showcase every symbol of wealth imaginable. And people noticed. Comments began changing. Supporters became skeptics. Skeptics became critics. Critics became investigators. Online communities dedicated to discussing Wes Watson started growing. Reddit users dug into public records. Fans compared old statements with new ones. Questions emerged about his lifestyle. Questions about his business. Questions about whether everything was as authentic as it appeared. One discovery generated particular attention. The mansion Wes often showcased as evidence of his success reportedly wasn't owned by him. It was leased. To some people, this wasn't a big deal. Plenty of wealthy individuals rent expensive properties. But for critics, it became symbolic. Because the issue wasn't whether he rented it. The issue was whether he intentionally allowed people to assume it was his. And that distinction mattered. The image of success was becoming more important than the reality behind it. Then came another controversy. A former customer publicly accused Wes of taking money for a coaching program and failing to provide what had been promised. According to the complaint, communication became difficult. Meetings were repeatedly delayed. Refund requests became a problem. Eventually, the customer was forced to recover his money through his bank. The story spread quickly. And it wasn't the only one. More complaints began surfacing from former clients who felt disappointed by their experiences. Whether every accusation was fair or not almost didn't matter anymore. The public narrative was changing. The man who once inspired people was now being accused of exploiting them. The former prison mentor was increasingly being described as a salesman. Or worse. A grifter. And perhaps the most damaging part was how Wes responded. Because every time someone criticized him, he seemed unable to ignore it. Unable to laugh it off. Unable to move on. Instead, he fought back. Aggressively. Publicly. Constantly. He insulted critics. Mocked followers. Attacked detractors. And with every angry response, he unintentionally reinforced the image people were forming. A man obsessed with dominance. A man obsessed with control. A man whose identity depended on being admired. The internet had begun questioning Wes Watson. And rather than calming the fire, he poured gasoline on it. What happened next would be even worse. Because criticism was no longer coming from former customers or anonymous Reddit users. Now, it was happening in public. In front of cameras. In front of audiences. And for the first time, millions of people would watch Wes Watson unravel in real time. From alpha male to internet laughingstock. For years, Wes Watson built his reputation on one idea. Strength. Not just physical strength. Mental strength. Emotional strength. The ability to stay calm under pressure. The ability to dominate difficult situations. The ability to control yourself when everyone around you loses control. At least, that was the image. The problem with building a brand around strength is that eventually, people start testing it. And when they did, Wes failed the test. Publicly. Repeatedly. One of the most important turning points came during a debate appearance connected to the Fresh and Fit platform. At first, it seemed like just another discussion. Different opinions. Different perspectives. Nothing unusual. But as the conversation progressed, something happened. Wes stopped arguing ideas. And started attacking people. When challenged on his views about success and self-worth, he immediately became defensive. Then angry. Then hostile. The discussion quickly transformed into something entirely different. Instead of responding to arguments, Wes questioned whether his opponent was proud of himself. Instead of defending his position, he attempted to intimidate. Instead of demonstrating confidence, he appeared desperate to prove superiority. For viewers watching at home, the moment was revealing. Because the man who spent years preaching discipline looked unable to control his own emotions. The man who constantly criticized weakness seemed threatened by simple disagreement. And the internet noticed. Clips spread everywhere. Reaction channels covered the confrontation. Comment sections exploded. Memes appeared. For perhaps the first time since becoming famous, Wes wasn't being viewed as intimidating. He was being viewed as insecure. That distinction changed everything. Because authority depends on perception. Once people stop taking you seriously, rebuilding that authority becomes almost impossible. And unfortunately for Wes, the situation only became worse. Instead of ignoring criticism, he became obsessed with it. Every video. Every live stream. Every interview. There always seemed to be another enemy. Another critic. Another hater. Another person who supposedly didn't understand him. The more criticism he received, the more aggressively he responded. Ironically, the people attacking him no longer had to do much work. Wes was damaging his own reputation. One outburst at a time. Meanwhile, online communities dedicated to discussing him continued growing. People began analyzing old clips. Examining contradictions. Questioning claims. Mocking behavior that once seemed impressive. The luxury lifestyle that once inspired admiration now generated ridicule. Especially when details emerged suggesting some of the symbols of wealth weren't exactly what many followers assumed. The infamous mansion became a perfect example. When critics discovered it was reportedly being rented rather than owned, the internet erupted. Again, renting a mansion isn't unusual. The issue was perception. Because many viewers felt the entire purpose of the mansion was to create the appearance of extraordinary success. And that realization led to a larger question. If the image was carefully manufactured, how much of the rest was real? The skepticism spread quickly. View counts began declining. Public perception continued shifting. Former fans became former customers. Former customers became critics. And the internet found something it loves more than success. Watching success unravel. By this stage, Wes was fighting battles on multiple fronts. Critics. Former clients. Reaction channels. Reddit communities. Journalists. Comment sections. And every new confrontation seemed to make things worse. But the most dangerous development wasn't happening online. It was happening in real life. Because somewhere along the way, Wes appeared to stop distinguishing between internet conflict and real-world conflict. For years, he had built his reputation around intimidation. Around dominance. Around proving he was the toughest person in the room. That approach may work on social media. It works much less effectively when police become involved. By late 2024, Wes seemed completely exhausted by the criticism. Fed up with the trolling. Fed up with the mockery. Fed up with the constant attacks. So he did something that would become one of the biggest mistakes of his career. He challenged his critics to confront him in person. To many people, it sounded like another angry rant. Another emotional reaction. Another moment that would disappear after a few news cycles. But this time was different. Because eventually, someone accepted the invitation. And what happened next would trigger a chain of events that threatened not only Wes Watson's career, but his freedom. The fight that changed everything. By the end of 2024, Wes Watson was no longer fighting for admiration. He was fighting for relevance. The prison stories that built his audience were years behind him. The self-improvement message had become buried beneath luxury cars, expensive watches, and endless arguments with critics. And everywhere he looked, people were laughing. Not listening. Not learning. Laughing. For someone whose identity revolved around respect, that may have been the worst punishment imaginable. The criticism seemed to affect Wes more than he wanted to admit. Every comment section became a battlefield. Every reaction video became a personal attack. Every critic became an enemy. Eventually, his frustration boiled over. In a series of public statements, Wes openly challenged his detractors. If they had something to say, they could say it to his face. If they wanted a confrontation, they knew where to find him. To his supporters, this was confidence. To his critics, it was recklessness. And soon, reality arrived. Because eventually someone decided to show up. At first, the incident sounded like the kind of story Wes had told 100 times before. A hater. A confrontation. A challenge. A fight. According to Wes's public version of events, he had simply defended himself. He described the other man as the aggressor. Someone who came looking for trouble. Someone who forced him to act. In Wes's telling, it was self-defense. Nothing more. But as details emerged, the story became much less favorable. Evidence suggested the situation wasn't nearly as simple as Wes presented it. Reports indicated that the confrontation escalated rapidly. What should have remained a verbal dispute became physical. And according to investigators, the force used went far beyond what would normally be considered necessary. The aftermath was brutal. The alleged victims suffered significant injuries. Facial swelling. Bleeding. Visible trauma. What had started as internet drama was now a police matter. And police don't care about YouTube subscribers. They don't care about motivational speeches. They don't care about online reputations. They care about evidence. Witnesses. Statements. Injuries. Facts. As law enforcement reviewed the incident, the situation became increasingly serious for Wes. Because this wasn't a first offense. This wasn't someone with a spotless history. This was a man who had already spent years in prison for violent crimes. A man with a criminal record. A man who was supposed to have learned from the consequences of his past. Instead, he appeared to be repeating them. When police eventually arrested Wes, the moment felt symbolic. Almost surreal. The man who built an empire teaching others how to avoid destructive behavior was once again standing on the wrong side of the law. And things became even worse during the legal process. Court hearings revealed the seriousness of the allegations. The victim's injuries were discussed. Protective conditions were imposed. And the possibility of additional consequences became very real. For years, Wes had portrayed himself as someone who had conquered his old life. Someone who had escaped the cycle. Someone who had evolved beyond the mistakes that landed him in prison. But now an uncomfortable question emerged. Had he actually changed? Or had success simply provided a larger stage for the same behavior? Because when you strip away the money, the followers, the luxury lifestyle, the social media image, the pattern looked strangely familiar. Conflict. Aggression. Escalation. Violence. Consequences. The exact pattern that destroyed his life the first time. Only now, millions of people were watching it happen. And unfortunately for Wes, the gym incident wasn't the end of the story. It was merely a warning. A preview of something much darker. Because while he was battling legal trouble from the assault case, another relationship was quietly falling apart behind closed doors. And the allegations that would emerge next were far more disturbing than anything the public had heard before. For years, critics accused Wes Watson of being a fraud. Soon, those accusations would seem insignificant. Because now he was facing accusations of something far worse. The monster behind the message. By 2025, Wes Watson's public image was already hanging by a thread. His reputation had been damaged. His business was under scrutiny. His legal problems were growing. And yet, the most devastating chapter of his story hadn't happened yet. Because while the internet focused on the gym incident, a different pattern was emerging behind closed doors. A pattern involving the women closest to him. Looking back, the warning signs had been there for years. Former partners had repeatedly described similar behavior. Control. Manipulation. Jealousy. Explosive anger. At first, many people dismissed these accusations as relationship drama. A messy breakup. A bitter ex. A personal dispute being played out online. But eventually, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Different women. Different relationships. The same allegations. One of those relationships involved Angie. By all appearances, the relationship struggled under the pressure of Wes's growing legal and personal problems. Public clips from their interactions revealed a dynamic many viewers found uncomfortable. Wes often spoke about needing constant attention. Constant validation. Constant acknowledgement. He didn't simply want a partner. He wanted reassurance. He wanted admiration. He wanted to feel important. Every single day. And when he didn't receive it, tension followed. What made these moments fascinating wasn't what they revealed about Angie. It was what they revealed about Wes. For years he had presented himself as the ultimate alpha male. The strongest man in the room. The most disciplined man in the room. The most confident man in the room. Yet beneath all that confidence seemed to be a man desperately seeking validation. A man who needed constant confirmation that he was respected. Desired. Admired. And that need appeared to be growing stronger as his public image weakened. Eventually, that relationship ended. Then came another. Morgan Osman. At first, everything seemed normal. The two reunited. Their relationship progressed quickly. Marriage was reportedly being discussed. From the outside, it looked like Wes had finally found stability. But appearances can be deceiving. According to later police reports, the relationship deteriorated rapidly. The details were disturbing. Authorities alleged that after Morgan attended a basketball game without him, Wes became furious. Phone calls reportedly escalated into threats. Accusations. Paranoia. Anger. Then, according to the report, things became physical. Investigators alleged that Wes grabbed her by the neck. Shook her. Dragged her by her hair. Pinned her against furniture. Threatened her. At one point allegedly telling her he would kill her and her family. If true, these accusations represented a level of violence far beyond anything the public had previously associated with him. And the allegations didn't stop there. According to the report, Morgan claimed she was prevented from leaving. That her movements were controlled. That her phone was taken. That messages were sent pretending everything was fine. The situation described by investigators was no longer an argument. It was something much darker. Eventually, Morgan escaped and contacted law enforcement. And once again, police arrived at Wes Watson's home. For the second time in a relatively short period, he found himself facing serious criminal allegations. This time, however, the circumstances were even worse. Because prosecutors now had something they didn't have before. A pattern. The gym incident. Previous allegations. Former partners. Witness statements. Police reports. Individually, each controversy could be debated. Together, they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. When officers took Wes into custody, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Years earlier, he had left prison promising he would never return to that life. Now he was being led back into the criminal justice system once again. Only this time, the fall was public. Millions of people had watched it happen in real time. The motivational speaker. The disciplined coach. The prison success story. The millionaire entrepreneur. All of it collapsing under the weight of his own decisions. The most tragic part wasn't the arrest. It wasn't the lawsuits. It wasn't even the possibility of another prison sentence. The tragedy was that Wes had already proven he was capable of building a different life. He had escaped prison, built a business, inspired people, created opportunities that most former inmates never receive. He had been given the second chance that countless others dream about. And yet somehow, he still found himself moving in the same direction. Toward conflict. Toward violence. Toward destruction. The destination had changed. The pattern had not. And that raises the central question of Wes Watson's story. Was prison ever really the problem? Or was the problem the man who walked out of it? Wes Watson became addicted to being Wes Watson. The easiest way to understand Wes Watson is to see him as a scammer. A fraud. A narcissist. A violent ex-con who eventually returned to the behavior that ruined his life the first time. And while there may be truth in some of those descriptions, they don't fully explain why millions of people listened to him in the first place. Because before the lawsuits, before the arrests, before the accusations, Wes Watson genuinely helped people. That is the uncomfortable reality. Thousands of men found motivation through his videos. Many started exercising. Many quit destructive habits. Many improved their lives. If Wes had nothing valuable to say, none of that would have happened. So the real question isn't, why did people believe him? The real question is, why did so many people need him? The answer has less to do with Wes himself and more to do with the modern world. For decades, traditional ideas of masculinity have been changing. Many men feel lost, disconnected, directionless. They are surrounded by endless advice but very little certainty. Then someone like Wes Watson appears. A man who never hesitates, never doubts himself, never apologizes, never looks weak. To someone searching for answers, that kind of certainty feels powerful. It feels attractive. It feels safe. Wes wasn't just selling fitness. He wasn't just selling coaching. He was selling certainty. And people bought it. Because certainty is one of the most valuable products on earth. The problem is that certainty can easily become arrogance. And confidence can easily become ego. Somewhere along the way, Wes stopped being a man who taught discipline. And became a man who performed discipline. Every workout became content. Every car became content. Every watch became content. Every house became content. Every relationship became content. His entire life became a stage. And the audience kept rewarding the performance. More views. More followers. More money. More praise. Until eventually something dangerous happened. The character became stronger than the person. Wes Watson wasn't simply playing the role of Wes Watson anymore. He appeared to believe it completely. The alpha male. The toughest man in the room. The smartest man in the room. The most disciplined man in the room. The most successful man in the room. And once you build your identity around being superior to everyone else, you create a problem. Because superiority requires constant proof. Someone is always richer. Someone is always stronger. Someone is always younger. Someone is always more successful. Which means the performance never ends. You must constantly defend the image. Constantly protect it. Constantly feed it. And eventually, that becomes exhausting. Many people assume fame changes people. But fame rarely creates new flaws. More often, it amplifies the ones already there. If someone is insecure, fame magnifies insecurity. If someone is arrogant, fame magnifies arrogance. If someone craves validation, fame becomes an addiction. And perhaps that is the most tragic part of Wes Watson's story. Prison wasn't where he lost his freedom. Prison may have been where he found it. The structure. The routine. The purpose. The discipline. The world outside was different. Outside prison, nobody tells you when enough is enough. Nobody tells you when success becomes obsession. Nobody tells you when confidence becomes narcissism. Nobody tells you when ambition becomes self-destruction. By the time the arrests happened, the lawsuits happened, and the allegations happened, the collapse was already underway. Those events didn't create the downfall. They revealed it. Because the downfall didn't begin in a courtroom. It didn't begin in a police station. It didn't begin at a gym. It began the moment Wes Watson started believing his own mythology. The moment he stopped trying to become a better man. And started trying to become a larger one. In the end, Wes Watson's story isn't really about prison. It's about identity. It's about what happens when a person spends years building an image powerful enough to inspire millions. Only to become trapped inside it. And perhaps that's why his story resonates with so many people. Because almost everyone wears a mask. Most of us are simply fortunate enough that millions of people aren't watching when it starts to crack. Wes Watson spent years teaching that every action has consequences. That discipline creates freedom. That weakness creates suffering. Today, he finds himself facing the consequences of his own choices. Not because the internet hated him. Not because critics targeted him. Not because success ruined him. But because the traits that once helped him rise were never brought under control. And eventually, they controlled him instead. The man who escaped prison built an empire. The man who built the empire destroyed it. And now, the same question hangs over his future that once hung over his past. Can Wes Watson change? Or was the downfall always inevitable?